Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started.
Good morning.
Thank you. My name is Kayla Kutzer. I'm a 1L here at PACE, and I'm the secretary of our SALDF chapter. I will be moderating the symposium today. Our panelists will be speaking about the effects of factory farming on the environment. Our first panelist is Edita Birnkrant. Ms. Birnkrant is the New York director for Friends of Animals. She heads up a number of animal advocacy campaigns, including the banning of horse-drawn carriages in New York City, the protection of urban wildlife, and vegan diet education. Today, Ms. Birnkrant will be speaking about the impacts of animal agriculture on wildlife. Our second speaker is Daniel Estrin. Professor Estrin is the supervising attorney at the Environmental Litigation Clinic here at PACE Law and is a PACE Law graduate. Professor Estrin has represented environmental advocacy organizations and concerned citizens in suits against factory farms and CAFOs. He will be discussing how factory farming impacts our water with regards to the Clean Water Act. Last but not least, our final panelist is Marianne Engelman Lado. Ms. Lado is the managing attorney of the Northeast Regional Office of Earthjustice and is an adjunct professor at Columbia Law. She has a background in civil rights advocacy and environmental justice work. Today, Ms. Lado will be addressing how factory farming impacts air quality with regards to the Clean Air Act. All three panelists will be welcoming questions after Ms. Lado speaks. Please join me now in welcoming all of our esteemed guests.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. So I'm the campaigns director for Friends of Animals, and just wanted to briefly go through some of the things we do. We run a sanctuary of mainly primates that were all taken from animal research, entertainment, or the pet trade, and that's in Texas. We have the nation's first and longest running spay-neuter program. We have a wildlife law program that works on a lot of different issues, and as was mentioned, we do promote a vegan diet. So, just to start everyone off on a positive note, the world is on the brink of what is being called the sixth great extinction, and species are disappearing faster than ever before. And a study released recently by the journal Science highlighted that species of plants and animals are becoming extinct at least 1,000 times faster than they did before humans were around. And it found that species are now disappearing from Earth about 10 times faster than biologists had believed. So to put this into context, there have been 5 times previously when a vast majority of the world's life has been obliterated in what have been called mass extinctions, and they're often associated with meteor strikes. So now we're on the verge of the sixth extinction, and whether we turn things around or not will depend completely on humanity's actions. And importantly, I believe, and many others, specifically on how we feed ourselves. So what has led us to being at this crisis point? The number one cause is habitat loss. Species are increasingly finding no place to survive due to human overpopulation into areas that were once their natural habitat. And directly connected to this is animal agriculture, which is responsible for an immense amount of habitat destruction. And in addition to the habitat loss to creating animal farms, an alarming number of wildlife are killed off by animal farmers or government agencies who claim that wild horses, bison, wolves, coyotes, and other predators are a threat to their livestock, or that they just simply have no right to exist on the land. So the number one cause is directly at the hands of human behavior. Another key factor is climate change, which affects where species can survive. And a significant cause of climate change is animal agriculture. So we come back again to our diet being the root cause. So fishing is another chief factor leading to the sixth extinction. We've basically decimated ocean life. And I really believe we need to officially retire the phrase overfishing, because at this point, all fishing is overfishing. Among the most serious threats to marine species worldwide is the voracious human appetite for seafood. Many groups of marine species, including sharks, groupers, and whales, are heavily impacted by anthropogenic threats, including destructive fishing methods like trawling and longlining. Again, diet is the root cause. Stocks of all marine species are fished for food are set to collapse by 2048. This is why it's very important to understand that there is no such thing anymore as sustainable seafood when the situation is this dire. So I believe all fishing must stop, and therefore all fish eating must stop. FOA's wildlife law program has legally challenged the federal government for failing to protect these imperiled marine species. We sued federal agencies responsible for failure to grant Endangered Species Act protections to several of them, and we have succeeded in getting several listed under the ESA, including the scalloped hammerhead, which was actually the first shark species to obtain an ESA listing, and 5 species of sturgeon. And these are important victories, but so much more needs to be done. So knowing the severity of the situation we're in makes this disturbing fact that I recently learned all the more alarming. McDonald's sells 75 burgers every second. And that works out to 4,500 burgers every minute. And of course, McDonald's is just one fast food company out of many, but I think it just kind of gives, a little bit of an insight into the scope of what people are eating and how it can seem almost difficult to comprehend. And that's why, without a doubt, educating and helping people realize how critically important it is to switch to a plant-based vegan diet is crucial. Literally billions of animals every year are bred and slaughtered just for food products in the US alone, and ocean life is decimated, resulting in immense suffering, devastation to our environment, and human health. So nearly half of Earth's entire land mass is used for farming, with a staggering 30% of Earth's land surface used for doomed livestock. So let that sink in, 30%. I think it's very obvious to anyone that this is not a sustainable situation on a planet with over 7 billion people and growing. And to put that figure into context, we have 7 billion humans on the planet and over 70 billion animals used for food. And that works out to more than 6 million animals killed for food every hour. Again, that's kind of a figure that's hard to even comprehend, 6 million every hour. And the waste all these animals produce is 130 times more than human waste is produced in the US, 1.4 billion tons from the meat industry annually, and a major source of air and water pollution, which my panel members will talk about, and human illnesses. How we feed the planet's population, currently at 7 billion and estimated to be at 9 billion by 2050, is one of the most, if not the most, important questions to answer in terms of what kind of world we will inhabit in the near and long-term future. So, in terms of land, of all the agricultural land in the US, 80% is used to raise animals for food and grow grain to feed them. That's almost half the total land mass of the lower 48 states. So how much land does it take to feed one person for 1 year? And of course, there can be differences in what you're eating, but overall, a vegan requires 1/6 of an acre of land to feed themselves for a year. A vegetarian requires 3 times as much land as a vegan, and a meat eater requires 18 times as much land as a vegan. And 1.5 acres can produce 37,000 pounds of plant-based food, in stark contrast to that 1.5 acres can only produce 375 pounds of meat. In terms of weight, the percentage of tons of the planet taken up by humans and livestock versus wildlife is astounding. There are 425 million tons of humans and livestock combined, and only 10 million tons of all wildlife on the entire planet. And the breakdown of that is there's 170 million tons of cattle, 80 million tons of sheep, 30 million tons of pigs, 20 million tons of poultry, 125 million tons of humans, and again, just 10 million tons of all the wildlife on the planet. And this is a shocking figure, especially considering that wildlife numbers are dwindling every day. And I know we're gonna focus on water later in the panel, but I just quickly wanted to go through the water footprint of food. And it takes 2,500 gallons of water or more to produce 1 pound of beef, and it takes 1,000 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of milk. And you can see the high numbers for other common animal products on the slide, and then the much lower numbers for plant-based foods and fruits on the other side. Of course, there's things that have a higher water footprint, like nuts, but in most cases they are still lower than any animal products. So throughout the world, humans drink 5.2 billion gallons of water and eat 21 billion pounds of food each day. And worldwide, just cows, drink 45 billion gallons of water and eat 135 billion pounds of food each day. And worldwide, the meat and dairy industries use 30% of the water in the world. And as most of us know, Western states are enduring a severe drought. In fact, California reportedly has only 1 year of water left and is enduring the worst drought in their entire history. And on April 2nd, California's governor instituted a mandatory 25% water use reduction rate for the first time in the state's history. Yet, large farms were exempt from this reduction despite the fact that roughly 80% of their water supply is used by agriculture, the bulk of it animal agriculture, which uses about 50%. And I know almonds were getting a lot of flack for using a lot of water, but really grown on over 1 million acres in California, alfalfa sucks up more than any other crop in the state, more water. And it has one primary destination. Who wants to guess?
Cows.
Give her a prize. Yes, cows, cattle. Increasingly popular grass-fed beef operations typically rely on alfalfa as a supplement to pasture grass. And alfalfa hay is also an integral feed source for factory farmed cows, especially used in dairy production. And plenty of this alfalfa is actually being exported to Asia. Alfalfa growers are now exporting some 100 billion gallons of water from this drought-ridden region of the world to the other side of the world in the form of alfalfa, all as more Asians are embracing the American-style meat-hungry diet. So scientists have predicted in a new study that by this century's end, the American West will face a historic mega-drought, the worst in 1,000 years, if the world stays on its current trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. Yet, knowing all this, how many in the scientific community or in government are connecting the dots and pointing the finger at animal ag and the dietary choices that are putting us all at risk? And I just want to talk about that. It's important to realize that animal products labeled as free-range, grass-fed, or cage-free are not the solution. And consumers and the public, and all of you here, I hope, will not buy into the myth that these products are somehow more humane or more sustainable for the environment. Of course, factory farms are hell on earth for animals and for everyone involved. But these other farming models that are often positioned as ethically and environmentally superior to factory farms are just not. Some of you may be aware that these humanely raised labels, and there's just some different labels on the slide there. These labels are often virtually meaningless or downright fraudulent, and no ALDF actually has done some legal work on fighting fraudulent labels, right? They really have very little federal oversight, and the animals killed under these labels still often endure horrific living and dying conditions, just as they do in factory farms. I have a slide that just kind of shows, like free-range operations for hens and dairies, and in most cases they're still enduring the same traumatic experiences. For the hens and the dairies, it's the same sabotage of motherhood, slaughter techniques, mutilations often performed with no anesthetic because that's not allowed on organic labels, illnesses treated with no antibiotics, and many, many documented cases of abuse, which I know we'll go into more of that on another panel. And as the demand for free-range and pasture-grazed animal products grow, and it is growing, so does the demand by ranchers for more livestock grazing areas. It's simply not possible to continue to produce the amount of animal products that the public demands by switching from factory farming to free-range farms. Just an example, if we raised all the cows in the US on grass, it would require using half the country's land, and that's just for cows. The reality is that substituting free-range grazing practices for intensively confined animals would drastically increase already perilous levels of wildlife habitat loss and species endangerment or extinction. There's really just no way to do it that doesn't destroy the environment and wipe out other species. The only truly sustainable way to feed over 7 billion people is through a plant-based diet, so our goal has to be to lessen the demand and to shift people away from eating animal products regardless of whether those products come from factory farms or free-range farms. And beyond the animals directly exploited and killed for these free-range products, the cost to wildlife is huge. Wild horses and burros, bison, wolves, coyotes, bobcats, bears, mountain lions, foxes, and more are being systematically wiped out by government agencies who act in the interests of ranchers. USDA's Wildlife Services kills millions of endangered and predator species every year to help livestock operators. Some of the gruesome methods used for killing these animals are poisons, steel jaw leg hold traps, strangulation neck snares, denning, which is the killing of coyote pups in their dens, hounding, shooting, and aerial gunning. At an annual cost to taxpayers of over $115 million. I've spared you the gruesome photos of those things because you don't need to see that. Getting back to the figure of McDonald's selling 75 burgers every second, 78% of cattle in the US are raised on factory farms, but what of the other 22%? The rest are largely grazing cattle that are raised on public and private lands across the US. So in total, the federal government owns around 640 million acres of public land, with cattle grazing taking up a solid 42% of this supposedly protected space. And a number of federal agencies rent out their lands to cattle and sheep ranchers. These lands are encompass national parks, forests, and protected range lands. I'm just going to ask a question now. How many of you here have spent time in a national park or forest and looked around and thought, you know what the landscape really needs here is a lot of cows grazing? Anybody? Good. I didn't think anybody would. So introducing cattle or sheep to these areas causes significant ecological damage. Public lands were never meant to be turned into livestock pasture land. They are riparian areas where wooded forests sit adjacent to important natural woodsheds or non-irrigated rangelands made up of shrubs, herbs, and native grasses. These places are filled with native plant and animal species that have developed to live in tune with the local environment. When livestock are introduced to these regions, here's essentially what happens. The land dries up and the native species die off. And additionally, we see the population of animals such as wolves and wild horses being wiped out because of cattle and sheep ranching. So it's those two factors. And yet with this staggering cost to the environment and wild species, there's also a high financial cost that taxpayers are forced to pay. And as an interesting note, livestock grazing on public lands was highly contentious when it was first proposed in the early 1900s. And John Muir was vehemently opposed to it, so I feel like I'm in good company with that. So around 21,540 ranchers have been given permits by the BLM, which is the Bureau of Land Management, or U.S. Forest Service, to turn these wild places into feeding grounds for their livestock. And the situation for wild horses in the West is especially dire. And this number is actually, should be lower, that, you know, the number is closer to, I think, 30,000 at this point. These wild horses are being brutally rounded up and removed from the public lands that they are supposed to be protected by law to be living freely on. The roundups are physically torturous and indiscriminate as the young, old, and even pregnant mares are forced into a violent stampede, chased by helicopters over rocky and dangerous terrain. The horses who do not collapse in exhaustion or become injured or die are corralled into holding pens for life. And I actually took that picture, and often sold to questionable buyers, some of which include slaughterhouses in Mexico and Canada. Their lives are over as soon as they are rounded up, as the close-knit family horse band that take years to form are forever destroyed. Why? Because free-range cattle and sheep ranchers on public lands, our lands, don't want them there, and our government is doing their bidding by exterminating them. And these public land ranchers are often called welfare ranchers, because they are heavily subsidized by the government. And in just the last decade, they have received $1 billion with a B, of our tax dollars. There are estimates of only about 30,000 wild horses left, and many states have completely lost their wild horse populations. There are 245 million acres of public land paid for by our tax dollars, managed by the BLM. 155 million acres, which is virtually all BLM land outside of Alaska, is open to livestock grazing, so basically all of it. By contrast, wild horses are restricted to just 26.9 million acres, all of which they're forced to share with livestock. So you clearly see who's getting priority. Yeah. Ratios of 200 to 1 of cows and sheep to wild horses are common on public lands. And I consider it a crime that wild horses are literally being wiped out by our own government, all for the benefit of free-range cattle and sheep ranchers. And amazingly, in spite of all evidence to the contrary, it's the horses that are being blamed by the government and the ranchers for degrading the land and for being overpopulated, even with the 200 to 1 ratios, and even though we know that it's the cattle and sheep that are degrading the land. But the numbers and the facts don't lie. The truth is that there aren't enough wild horses. All the herds managed by the BLM are at such low numbers that they are not genetically viable, meaning that they are being managed to extinction. And in the past year, I've observed wild horse herds up close, living free in western states, and these photos are some of that I took. And it's such a beautiful sight, but it's one that will not be here for future generations if things don't change. I've also visited the wild horse holding pen, which you see in the lower left, and these are where the horses end up after they've been ripped from their families. And more wild horses are in these holding pens for life. About 50,000 more of them are there than that are living free, and that shouldn't be happening at all. So Friends of Animals is very involved in the wild horse issue, and we are legally challenging roundups. And we had a recent legal victory in Nevada with a lawsuit where we stopped a roundup of hundreds of horses in the Pine Nut Mountain range from happening, and those are actually horses in the Pine Nut Mountains that I took photos of. And we have legally petitioned the government to list wild horses under the Endangered Species Act. We believe the only way to save the species from extinction is for them to be granted endangered species status so that roundups and removals won't be allowed to happen. All federal and state public lands should be preserved for wildlife. But the opposite is the reality today, where ranchers graze millions of cattle and sheep at a devastating cost to the environment and to the wildlife being wiped out in the process. And this is really the true cost of free-range farming that many people are completely unaware of. Even sometimes people in the animal advocacy world are unaware of that. And if you leave here with nothing else from my talk today, remember that in every package of Happy Meat, every carton of free-range milk or eggs, there's dead wildlife that are merely considered collateral damage. And if you buy it and if you consume it, it's being done in your name. If the labels of these products were truly accurate, they list the body counts of wild animals included as well as the animals that were killed directly for the product. And America's last remaining wild bison in the West are also being wiped out for the same reason. Free-range ranchers want them dead. Today, Yellowstone National Park has the last 3,000 to 4,000 genetically intact bison left in the U.S., as well as one of only 3 free-roaming bison herds left in the country, but that number is too low to ensure a genetically healthy population. When buffalo migrate beyond the park and enter Montana, Department of Livestock officials go on the attack. Arbitrary boundaries are drawn, and America's last buffalo are destroyed for stepping across a line into Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. We also have a legal effort underway to get wild bison listed under the ESA. So my point in connecting all these issues is that there is no better way to breed, raise, and slaughter billions of animals for food. The answer is to shift the public away from the products of animal agriculture, which is inherently violent, unsustainable, and egregiously wasteful of precious resources on every level, and to shift towards a plant-based diet which uses vastly less resources. That is, you can't argue that point, and it is, of course, I believe, a more ethical, responsible way to eat, both for the animals involved in animal agriculture and for the wildlife that we share the planet with. Because I want to end on a little bit of a positive note, I'd like to mention a promising development maybe some of you know about, that for the first time ever, a federal panel that helps set dietary guidelines is recommending Americans eat less meat because it's better for the environment. So this advisory committee is a federally appointed panel of nutritionists. They decided for the first time this year to factor in environmental sustainability in its recommendations. And they include a finding that a diet lowering animal-based foods is not only healthier, but has less of an environmental impact. And of course, not surprisingly, this sparked outrage and a lot of pushback from the meat industries. They're going nuts. But that's, one of the quotes that I thought was very, like a game changer in a way for this federal panel that has influence over our dietary guidelines. For the first time ever, I think it really shows a shift in the attitudes and the collective conscious about this, even in the mainstream. So I think it's a real positive step. Ultimately, the USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services will use this report and recommendations to draft the final guidelines for 2015, and it's due out later this year. And the public is actually encouraged to send in comments by May 8th on the advisory committee's recommendations. So I urge all of you, send in some comments saying you agree with this, and this should be what the new dietary guidelines are based on. So that's it from me. Thank you, everyone. I'm not sure how we get to the next.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see so many faces here on this beautiful Saturday, and it's inspiring to me that so many of you have come out for this conference. I should say at the beginning that I think any one of our sort of subtopics on this panel could easily take up a whole day of conference. I mean, these things are extremely complex and involve such a broad range of issues, so I think each of us is sort of necessarily giving you kind of a 10,000-foot view of the subtopic that we've been asked to speak on. Here's my photograph. That's not good at all. I hope that's not moving in case. Oh,
Just that one.
Okay, well, this was supposed to be a photograph showing the concentration of swine CAFOs in North Carolina, in eastern North Carolina. And there are hundreds of these facilities just in the state, and I've done a lot of work in North Carolina. To me, it's a really interesting case study. This has happened basically in the past 20 years. When a politician named Wendell Murphy came up with this idea of integrating the hog industry the way poultry had integrated that industry decades before. And so we saw this conversion over a relatively short period of time of a large number of smaller hog farms into this enormous number of huge factory farms in about the worst possible place that you'd want to do something like this. So most of these farms are located in the coastal floodplain. These are sandy soils, high water table, and basically, I wish my photo came through. I have a much smaller version of it here. But if you look at this map, you sort of are left with, there's no question that you just get an idea how much waste is being flushed out into the environment, into surface waters, into groundwaters, and into the ocean. It's unfortunate that didn't come through. It's always been perplexing to me how the way the law has developed in our country, how differently we treat animal waste and human waste, and focusing on the Clean Water Act. So, and why do we do that? We have this sort of idea that farms and farming is this sacred practice in the United States, and this goes back to the earliest days of our country. And I just put one quote up here from Thomas Jefferson, those who labor the earth are the chosen people of God. And so there's, we find all of these exemptions in our environmental laws that are essentially designed to protect farmers from the requirements that we impose on other industries. So, is there any factual or technical basis to treat animal waste differently than we treat our own sanitary waste, which generally we require be sent to sewage treatment plants, get secondary treatment, be disinfected before it's discharged into the environment. I don't believe there is. I think it's all based on this fraud, and the fraud is that CAFOs are zero discharge or non-discharging facilities. And so this comes from this idea that before the advent of these giant factory farms, you had what we think of as our kind of typical mom and pop farm, family farm. And for smaller farms, manure actually is a valuable fertilizer. And so while it's not truly a closed system, it is open to the environment, and certainly some pollutants are lost. You had, under the old model, you had farmers growing corn, which they then fed to their pigs, and I'm focusing on pigs here, to grow their pigs, and then they would take the manure from those pigs to fertilize the fields to grow more corn to feed their pigs, right? So they had some interest in for example, not applying manure to farm fields right before it rained, for example, because that most of that manure is going to be washed away, and it's not going to serve any purpose as fertilizer. The model that we see for CAFOs is very, very different. So in North Carolina, for example, we see these enormous imports of corn. Basically, they're buying feed for the pigs from wherever they can get it the cheapest. They're not growing corn on these facilities to feed to their pigs. So they're bringing corn in by the trainload to feed to the pigs, and so you see this relatively small area in eastern North Carolina having this enormous import of nutrients, and that we've never seen before. And that's causing all kinds of significant environmental problems. So what I'm positing here is that there's really no basis to treat these wastes differently from a scientific or technical standpoint. It's purely, essentially, a policy decision based on a fraud. So these are some of the pollutants we typically find in CAFO waste, which is primarily made up of animal manure and urine. And I've just been talking about nutrients. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the nutrients of biggest concern, and generally phosphorus is more of a concern in freshwater systems, and nitrogen is more of a concern in saltwater systems in terms of these large algae blooms that we see that really significantly degrade water quality. The waste also carries with it an enormous oxygen demand, and that comes from the algae blooms, but it also comes from the manure itself. So you're basically putting all of this food into our surface water systems, which bacteria eat, and so that allows these enormous populations of bacteria to grow. They use up enormous amounts of oxygen as they grow and reproduce, and then when they die, all those bacteria decay, which uses even more oxygen. And we see the problems, for example, in the dead zone in the Gulf, which is primarily attributable to all of the agricultural operations in the Mississippi, along the Mississippi River. There are over 40 diseases that can be transferred from humans to humans through manure. I've listed a few of them here. Piscidia is one of was discovered just in the last 15 years or so. Dr. Joanne Burkholder at North Carolina State has been doing a lot of research on this. It's a one-cell dinoflagellate organism that goes through over 20 different life stages, and I believe 4 or 5 of those are toxic. It's blamed for large fish kills, and many people who, fishermen and other people who work near the water, have said that they have felt health effects from exposure to this organism. At this point, the researchers are very careful about whether that's been proved, but there's certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence that this is causing problems for people in terms of headaches, vision problems, lesions, and skin problems. Very nasty stuff. Antibiotics have been in the news quite a bit lately. Superbugs, I mean, you have this sort of, it's kind of a sick science experiment where we're pumping these enormous amounts of antibiotics into these animals to essentially to help them grow, where they're being exposed to all of these different pathogens. And so we have this kind of perverse, natural selection, survival of the fittest science experiment going on, both in the animals themselves and in the waste lagoons, because a lot of the antibiotics wind up being excreted. And so you have these, they call them lagoons, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with CAFOs, but they're basically giant cesspools of animal waste open to the air. And they're basically giant cauldrons where the weaker pathogens get killed off, and the ones that can survive exposure to these antibiotics reproduce. So it's Darwin's theory, and it's really I'm very concerned that it's going to come back to bite us, and many scientists are too. We also find heavy metals and salts in this waste. So there are a lot of different ways that CAFOs are polluting our waters, and there's exposure to both surface waters and groundwaters. So I've listed a few of them here. One of the biggest concerns, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes, is that the lagoons, these pits that are designed to hold the waste, are designed to leak. And so they discharge massive amounts of this wastewater into groundwaters, and they contaminate groundwater aquifers. And so nitrogen is a major problem, because in a lot of these rural areas, people are drinking well water. So you see elevated amounts of nitrogen, which can cause a lot of different problems. The most well-known one is blue baby syndrome. This gets a little bit more specific about sort of common pathways. It's important to understand how these CAFOs operate. And again, I'm talking right now primarily about hod CAFOs in North Carolina. So they keep thousands of animals in these barns, and underneath the barns are pits. So basically they wash all of the manure that from the barns. The animals never get outside. They're inside their entire lives. The manure gets washed down into these pits, from which it gets piped into these lagoons, and then it gets sprayed out on spray fields. They're just giant waste disposal systems. Most of these facilities are not growing any commercially viable products or crops. Many of them in North Carolina grow Bermuda grass, which they then bale up and set on the side of the fields, because the nitrogen content is so high that it's actually toxic to cattle, so it can't even be fed to livestock. And I'll show some photos in a few minutes, just so you can see some of these pathways. So these lagoons are typically earthen. They're not lined like you would expect, for example, in a modern sanitary landfill. And like I said, they're designed to leak. I'll also show a couple photos in a minute of what can happen. I mean, these facilities are completely open to the elements, right? So, another thing that we associate with North Carolina is hurricanes. Typically, when they come up the East Coast, North Carolina is often a bullseye. And so we've seen over the past 20 years a few events where these facilities get completely inundated with floodwater. The lagoons get completely emptied as a result. They mix with the floodwater, so you have, in addition to all of the waste we see always flowing from these facilities into the environment, you have these massive events where all of the lagoon waste will wind up entering the environment. These events also typically wind up killing all of the animals on the facilities. This is a photo from Hurricane Floyd, and if you can't tell, that's the roof of one of these hog houses. So the waters in this photo are probably about 10 or 12 feet high, and these pigs are trying not to drown. Most of the pigs that were on these facilities during Hurricane Floyd, which is when this photo was taken, did in fact die. These events, again, they don't happen often, but when they do, they are truly catastrophic. This photo, you have to look a little bit more carefully to see the discharge. So this is what a typical lagoon looks like on one of these facilities, and you'll see Rick Dove's name mentioned in a few of these photos, and he's with Waterkeeper Alliance and has been very involved in these issues in North Carolina for a long time, and has formed what he calls the Air Force to go out and photograph what the facilities are doing and how they're operating. Most of these facilities are in areas where the public cannot view what's going on. They're surrounded by posted private property, and it makes enforcement very, very difficult. So you really need to do things like a radar or air surveillance if you want to try to catch these guys in the act. So if you look in the lower left-hand corner of this photograph, you can see where the discharge is occurring. And that's there's a spray gun set up there, and they're over-applying waste to the field, which is running right into the wetlands and streams that are behind the tree line there. And this is another view of that same event. They came down a little bit lower in the plane, but you can see all of that waste that's running right down into this wetland and then into the surface waters. So I mentioned the fraud that these facilities are zero discharge, and like I said, this kind of event isn't common, but hard to call that zero discharge, right? I mean, all of the waste and lagoons on this facility wound up entering surface waters as a result of this storm event. So I've been talking primarily about North Carolina, and that's where most of my experience is, but lest anyone think that this is only a problem in North Carolina, these photos were taken in upstate New York about a year ago. And in New York, our animal product of choice is not hogs, but yogurt. And so dairy farms are prevalent in upstate, all around the state. And in fact, the state has been going through a process to deregulate dairy farms and to reduce the regulatory burden on these farms to try to foster the dairy and particularly the Greek yogurt industry. New York State is the #1 yogurt producer in the country. Owasco Lake is a drinking water supply, and this is an event that occurred because New York allows winter spreading of cow waste, dairy waste. So the first picture is a manure spreading vehicle, which is spreading manure on a frozen farm field. And I believe that photo was taken in February. And a week or two later, there was a large melt and rainstorms, which of course washed all of that. Now, if you're spreading waste, the idea of spreading waste on fields is that crops are going to uptake the nutrients, right? And are essentially going to process the waste. If you're spreading waste on a frozen field where nothing is growing, how is that going to happen? Of course it's not. And of course that ice and snow is going to melt, and of course it's going to rain, and so we have all of that waste washing into surface waters. And if you can't tell, all of this brown stuff in the lake here, that's a huge plume of manure that is washed into a drinking water supply in upstate New York. So this is a problem that's going on all over the country, not just in North Carolina. So I mentioned that, and I know my focus was supposed to be on the Clean Water Act, but I mentioned that enforcement is very difficult. The Clean Water Act, in order to enforce against a violator, requires that you prove a discharge of pollutants into the waters. The other problem with the Clean Water Act is that the way the regulation has developed, the Clean Water Act exempts from the discharge definition what they call agricultural stormwater discharges. And so there's been a lot of rulemaking and litigation around what does that mean, agricultural stormwater. And so basically what the law says is that if a CAFO is operating in accordance with what's called a certified nutrient management plan, which means a planner comes onto the farm and considers the soil types, the slopes, how much phosphorus is in the soil, how close the fields are to surface waters, etc., develops a plan that basically tells a farmer how much waste can safely be applied to the farm fields over what period of time. And so the presumption is if a farm is operating in accordance with one of those plans, that any pollution that winds up being discharged from the facility into the water is deemed to be an agricultural stormwater discharge and falls within the exception. So all of these facilities, or virtually all of them, are discharging pollutants into the water. And that's the technical reality. But being able to enforce the Clean Water Act against them for doing that is a difficult proposition. So in a case we brought against Smithfield Foods back in 2000, we alleged not just violations of the Clean Water Act, but violations of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, which regulates solid waste and hazardous waste disposal. And we asserted what was then a novel claim that that essentially Smithfield was disposing of its hog waste, which is solid waste, that was our allegation, and was violating regulations relating to open dumping and was causing an imminent substantial endangerment to human health and the environment. There are provisions in RCRA and the regulations about manure, and that the industry insisted exempted animal manure from the RCRA solid waste definition. But when you look carefully at those exemptions, they talk about animal waste being returned to the soil as fertilizer. And so the argument we made before the court in North Carolina was that you're not returning this waste to the soil as fertilizer if you're over-applying it. And so we argued that this is really a factual inquiry, and it's not a blanket exemption of manure from the solid waste definition. And I believe this is the first case where a court had anything to say about that, and the court agreed with us and said that it is a factual inquiry and ultimately denied the defendant's motion to dismiss our RCRA claim. This case later settled, so we never wound up with a finding of liability. We never wound up essentially proving the fact that we were alleging, which is that they were over-applying, and having the court reach a final judgment on that question. But 14 years later, just earlier this year, a court did have occasion to finally rule on this question, and I'll caution everyone that I think it's likely that this will be appealed, so we'll have to see what the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has to say about it if that happens. But earlier this year, a district court in Washington State, considering an enormous amount of factual evidence demonstrating that the owner of this facility, Cow Palace, had handled its waste in a way that demonstrated as a matter of fact that it was discarded, that it wasn't preserving it, wasn't treating it as a valuable product for purposes of fertilization, and that in fact it was being discarded, and ruled that the facility owner was liable under RCRA. So this is a huge decision. The citation is here. I urge you all to read it. It's really a very well-reasoned and well-written decision. I don't want to suggest this is an easy judgment to get. When you read the decision, you see how much factual evidence the plaintiffs put before the court, and it was really quite impressive. But I think this is really the cutting edge of enforcement against CAFOs, and if you're interested in the subject, I urge you to read this decision, and I'm happy to answer any questions you all have.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I know it's been sitting a long time. I'm going to try to be energetic, if only to keep you awake, and try to get through things pretty quickly, so at least we have a couple of minutes for Q&A. let me start by saying a few words about Earthjustice and my role at Earthjustice and why I'm here talking about this, then touch on some of the air impacts. I think you can, having seen the lagoons, visualize, experience the air impacts by seeing all that waste in a lagoon or a cesspool, but talk just a minute about the way in which they affect human health, waterways, the ecosystem, and particularly the environments for fish and animal life, and then talk about some of the strategies that we're using. I have to admit there's false advertising. I'm really not going to talk about the Clean Air Act, so sorry. But I will touch on it and then talk about other strategies to get at air issues. So first, Earthjustice. We're a legal organization, ta-da. The mission of the organization, we work on issues affecting wildlife and oceans and what we call magnificent places, iconic spaces. We work on issues of clean energy and climate change. And then where my space is, we work on healthy communities. And that includes issues of air and water and other issues affecting human health and protecting the right of all people to a healthy environment. My own background is in civil rights, and so I come at this issue of industrial animal agriculture and animal agriculture generally by looking at where it's affecting people most acutely and the distribution of those effects. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But I started my focus with an environmental justice perspective. Having said that, I've stumbled into what people have already described is the intertwined harms associated with industrial agriculture. That is, 15 years ago when I was at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, our director counsel, who has since passed away, a great man named Julius Chambers, had come from North Carolina. And while I was there, people in North Carolina called the Legal Defense Fund and talked to Julius and said, we have this huge problem that Dan talked about. We went from having about 25,000 farms with some pigs on them, and many of them were African American owned. They were in old tobacco areas. What Dan didn't say is, unlike other states like Iowa where facilities are spread across the whole state, in North Carolina they're all in the eastern part of the state. And that's where the sandy soils and low-lying coastal plain is. And that's also disproportionately African-American. And people were losing their farms because when someone like Smithfield comes in, they don't need all the little farms. They don't want to contract with lots of little farmers. They want a few big farmers that they can control. And in fact, Smithfield owns the pigs when Dan talked about vertical integration and Smithfield's role. So the way in which in the poultry industry or the hog industry, it works a little bit different in cows, but the Perdue's, the Smithfields, the Cargills, they actually own the chickens and the pigs. And then they say, gee, you guys are small. I don't think, you guys want to retire, right? So I'm no longer going to contract with you. But you're still in high school. You're going to be big. I can tell. I see you're a star. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the process of having a modern facility. You're going to take out $4 million in loans, and you're going to be backed by federal guarantees, and you're going to have a beautiful facility and have a contract with me. That's so lucky. And you are going to have stability in price because you're going to have a contract, and you're going to feel good about your land. Now you guys, you all lost your property, sorry, but you're great. Okay, that's vertical integration because then I own the pigs. I'm Smithfield, I own the pigs. I give you the pigs to raise for a little bit of time. I take them back, and the vertical part is we grow, and then I take them to the slaughterhouse. I own the slaughterhouse. And I take them to market. I control the market, and I set the price on the market, according to market conditions. That's the vertical integration part. So this whole system depends on the way I, a Cargill, a Purdue, a Smithfield, model that industry. And the way it's modeled to be modern is I want big facilities. I want to not have to send my trucks to lots of different places. All of the animals, as Dan said, are put inside. The odd thing about when you go to eastern North Carolina, despite the fact that it's number 2 in the country on pigs, and they're all located in a small little area, and it's number 2 or 3 on turkeys and chickens, is you never see animals outside. You walk around, you see the smell, you smell the smell, but you don't see pigs, you don't see chickens. They're all inside. So they're all inside they're all homogeneous. There's no biodiversity. They're all Smithfield's pigs, right? Or Cargill's chickens. Now I know, I've done my investment in R&D, I know what makes a really easy slicing chicken. So I have the same kind of chicken, one kind, genetically uniform. I don't have, 100 different kinds of cows out in the yard, or 100 different kinds of chickens that lay all kinds of beautiful eggs. I have one type genetically. And then I feed them what I think is going to make them grow faster, and I give them all antibiotics. So we've got huge animal welfare problems, that some of which were discussed before, about gestation crates and overcrowding and indoors and never enjoy the outdoor space. We've got growth of antibiotic resistance. We've got huge ground and surface water problems from the enormous amount of waste. We've got the stink of living nearby. We've got air pollution. We've got, just enjoyment of property. People used to sit outside in North Carolina and enjoy the rural way of life. Now they come outside, and I'll show you a picture of the sprayer, and Dan showed one too. They got this spraying, wind comes along, all of a sudden they're sitting on their porch, which they just don't do anymore, but they used to sit on the porch, and there would be literally manure spray in their face, on their porch, right? You can't enjoy your property. You have decline of property values, terrible health outcomes, lack of biodiversity. So what I realized in eastern North Carolina, there's this environmental justice issue, right? Because the greatest density of these facilities is in this area, which can't support the, in terms of fertilization, all the things Dan talked about, can't support that amount of nutrient. You have the greatest density in Duplin County, #1 county in the country for number of pigs per person. It's 43 pigs per person. 43 pigs per person. That's not even counting all the poultry. So you've got all these things coming together. And what's so great right now about entering this field is there are so many terrific people. There are people caring about animal welfare. There are people caring about groundwater. Each person, each group feels that they've got the answer. If we just could do something about groundwater, it would pull that string and unravel the whole thing. If we could just do something about the waste. And the truth is, these things are all connected. So this is kind of a map of a typical hog, I think this is actually a dairy farm, but it has some of the elements that I just want to say. We're talking about air pollution in this section, and air pollution comes from a number of different places. It comes from I don't want to call them barns because that suggests like the big red barn, but the indoor facility comes from that place. So if you live nearby that place, it stinks. And they have, I'll show you a picture of ventilator fans. So if it's chickens, we work, I'll tell you about, on a case called Roseacre Farms with capacity for 4 million chickens. If you didn't have big ventilator fans, the chickens would all asphyxiate. So they blow all the yuck, all the phosphorus, everything out of the facility. That smells something fierce. You got these open lagoons. If you haven't already seen the drone video, how many people have seen the drone video? Okay, go online to YouTube, see the drone video. Just Google drone video, and you'll see, I think there are like 4 million hits right now. But they show these photographs of the cesspools, of the lagoons. All of these places, and then we got the spray fields, all of these places create huge smell. And this is just a picture of the ventilator fans from a facility. You can see how big they are. So these are some of the sources of air pollution. This is a picture of the spraying on a spray field. You can imagine all of the air pollution, all of the smell. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Dan talked about the water pollution, because where does all this go after you spray it out? It goes into the ground. In some places it will wind up in the groundwater, it winds up in the surface water. But in the meantime, it's also air pollution that affects people's health and quality of life. Briefly, before I get into why does it affect people's health and quality of life, I just want to use one more example. So I have clients in North Carolina, and we work all across the country. I have a case we actually share a case in New York. We have a case in Arkansas. This is a national problem, a lot of problems in dairy CAFOs in California. But imagine in North Carolina, if you live within, let's just say, 3 miles of 5 to 10 CAFOs. 5 to 10, and forget poultry for a second, because that's going to be a compounding effect. But just the hog CAFOs. Each one has, say, 5,000 pigs. We know pigs make about 3 times the waste of humans, so that's the equivalent of 15,000 people, okay? Their waste is all in an open cesspool that's untreated. So imagine now you're living within 3 miles of 5 to 10 towns of open cesspools of enough waste for 15,000 people. Can you imagine what that would smell like? That's what people are living with in North Carolina. So these are some of the chemicals that come out, that come through the air. They affect the environment and cause quality of life and also mental health issues. There's a guy named Steve Wing who's done a lot of work on living, the relationship between living in proximity to hog CAFOs in North Carolina and in Mississippi, and also poultry CAFOs on incidents of asthma and hypertension and other issues. Some of the known health effects include nausea, diarrhea, psychophysiological problems, sinus, skin, and when you talk to people who live near these facilities, they really experience them. Like with many toxic problems, you don't quite know whether it was the CAFO or maybe something else, or maybe my grandmother smoked, and so causation is a difficult problem, but in fact, the epidemiological studies do relate living in proximity to those problems. Okay, so what are our tools to address air impacts? There are a whole bunch of tools, and that's something in a law school that we should focus on, or particularly speaking to students here. There isn't one strategy for addressing a problem. You got to be creative as an advocate and think about the multiple strategies you can use. And that's precisely why I'm not talking about the Clean Air Act. Go look that up in your law books. We want to talk about how do you use kind of creative strategies to get at some of the problems. But I would be remiss if I didn't say something about the Clean Air Act. And particularly, there are a couple of cases that were filed. As you probably already know, we all have the right to petition the government, and the government has to respond to our petitions. And if it doesn't, we can go to court and say, gee, they haven't responded to our petition for rulemaking. Well, the Humane Society of the U.S. and the Environmental Integrity Project each filed petitions under the Clean Air Act in 2008 and 2009 to address some of these problems, to regulate ammonia, to regulate these facilities as what are called stationary sources of hazardous air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. EPA didn't respond to those petitions, and they just went to court to get EPA to do something about these problems. So there are tools in the Clean Air Act, and we'll see where that goes. But I want to talk about some of the other tools that we have. Take a breath. Okay, part 2. So here are some of the tools. Last week we filed a case under CERCLA and EPCRA. That's the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, that's CERCLA, and the Environmental Planning and Community Right to Know Act, that's EPCRA. And the deal here is that if you're emitting hazardous air pollutants, you got to report it so the communities around you know. As a result of, as part of a series of midnight rules before the Bush administration left office, they exempted industrial animal facilities from these rules. So everyone else has to report your air emissions, but not CAFOs, not confined animal feeding operations. Earthjustice went to court on behalf of a whole bunch of organizations to try to do something about this. And in 2009, we sued the Obama administration. The Obama administration said, oh, we get it, don't worry, we're a new administration, it's a new day, hope, change, all that. And we kind of wanted some teeth in a settlement agreement. We couldn't come to an agreement. We wanted to say, okay, if you're going to revisit this exemption, we want to make sure something's going to happen. They wouldn't settle for any kind of judicially enforceable consent decree. The circuit court remanded the case back to the agency for rulemaking to revisit this exemption and come out with a new rule. They basically have done nothing. They did this study of emissions modeling. The study was flawed. They're kind of stuck, and it's called the NAMES study, if anybody wants to look it up. And basically they've done very little. So last week we went back to court on behalf of Center for Food Safety and Sierra Club and HSUS and Environmental Integrity Project and a couple, and Waterkeeper and a couple of other groups. And together we're trying to get the Obama administration to at least require reporting. And of course, if you require reporting, you have information at your fingertips, and that is mobilizing for communities that can both know what's going on in their community and do something about it. Okay, so we got Clean Air Act, we got CERCLA, EPCRA. On to the next thing. This is a photo I took just a couple weeks ago while having the great pleasure of floating down the Buffalo River, which is a 135-mile free-flowing, undammed river in near the Ozarks, and that's a beautiful bluff. This area is known for its gorgeous bluffs. It's also karst geology. Water is not part of this discussion, but I want to say what you can see is holes in the rock, essentially, from the karst geology. And so, to add to Dan's point, if you have facilities that are using spray fields or cesspools, lagoons, where the manure just kind of comes out, what happens is they come out and they go down into that rock and just literally pour it into the water, and I actually saw some of that. So this beautiful, beautiful river, which I highly recommend, just about everybody in Arkansas seems to have floated down it, which is a good thing for our case. This beautiful river it was the site of a few small farms, but about a few years ago, Cargill decided it wanted you, didn't want you anymore. So it said, you guys want to retire, right? Yeah. And it took this guy, Jason Henson, by the hand, and it helped him to have a modern facility. The state of Arkansas put forward their first permitting program for large confined animal feeding operations, and C&H Farms got the first permit for a large confined animal feeding operation under the Clean Water Act, and NIPD's permit. Nobody really knew that this was happening until the facility was built, and it was a facility for 6,500 pigs in the watershed of this, and I don't know if I said this is the first national river in the country. It was a huge fight over making this a national river, to keep it undammed, to keep it protected. It's free-flowing from the Ozarks. It's just fundamentally beautiful. And the first thing I saw about this case was a letter that had come out from the National Park Service with 43 points about the environmental assessment that the Farm Service Agency did. So what happened is, as I said, the farmer was just like a guy who had a farm with a few hundred pigs that in his farm had been, in his family for generations. And Cargill said, you're going to modernize, here's how you do it. And he went and hopped like $3 to $4 million. And he went to farm credit, and he got the credit. And in fact, it turns out that it's really hard to get credit as a farmer unless you have a contract with a Cargill. So there's a whole, for those of you who are interested in economics, go into this field. We need you. There's a whole economic piece to this. And anyway, so he goes into hop $3 to $4 million. He's the middle guy. You can't be too mad at him compared to the Cargills or the state, the people that are responsible for protecting us. And then he can't get that money on the market because it isn't stable enough. So it has to be backed by a guarantee. And the federal government, through the Small Business Administration, the Farm Services Agency, backs the loan that he gets from the credit agency. They do it, Small Business Administration, without any paying attention to any of the obligations, like NEPA to do an environmental analysis, or checking on an endangered species under ESA. They don't do any of that. Farm Services Agency does an environmental assessment, but this letter I saw from the National Park Service said there are 43 major problems in this assessment. They say they consulted with the National Park Service. They didn't. They say they consulted with on endangered species, with Fish and Wildlife. They didn't. I mean, literally, they did everything totally wrong. So we went to court against the federal agencies that had backed the loan, and we won. And a court, this is, by the way, a picture of C&H Farms from the air. Those are the two facilities and their open air lagoon. And the reason I'm focusing on this as an air issue, it's also a water issue, is, I don't know if you can see that word school and that word track and that word play, and those fields are the fields where the spraying is done. And the buffalo goes through right between the track and the field. So there's a water issue here, but also there's a terrible stink and air issues right next to where the kids play in Mount Judy School. So Judge Marshall in Arkansas in federal court said that the federal agencies had the obligation to do a real environmental assessment. They have to go back and do it under the Endangered Species Act, and under NEPA, and it has to take account of some of these issues, the air issues, the water issues, the karst geology, the sensitive populations, the children in the school, etc. Very quickly, there's another direction in which air is an issue. We can get at it through the Clean Water Act, that there's under-regulation through air laws, but as Dan said, sometimes the pollutants are coming out of these ventilator fans and then landing in water. In this case, this is Roseacre Farms, I mentioned it, it has capacity for 4 million chickens. That's a picture of the ventilator fans, and it's right next to Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, which has tremendous wetlands. So you've got all this ammonia, you've got all this phosphorus, you've got particulate matter, all coming out of these huge ventilator fans. There aren't that many people living there, but it is going into ditches and out toward the waterways, and also the wind is blowing it directly into the waterways. They had a permit under the Clean Water Act initially when they went up for their renewal. And there had been some controversy about their initial permit because they were right near this National Wildlife Refuge. When they went up for their renewal, the facility said, the state said, we think that there's a lot of discharge here into the water. We want you to think about your best management practices under the nutrient management plan that Dan was talking about. They weren't very strict. They were things like, consider the feed that you're giving the birds, because there are lower emission feeds that you can use. There are feeds that produce less phosphorus or whatever. Consider this and that. They really weren't very strict. But the farm felt like, why should we be under the burden of doing this stuff? And the Poultry Federation, and so they decided to contest the best management practices that were required of them. And then the Poultry Federation came in and said, gee, don't just contest the best management practices. We don't understand why you're under a Clean Water Act permit to begin with, because this is an air issue. So they brought a contested case and they challenged the Clean Water Act's jurisdiction, essentially, over this facility because the emissions were coming through the air and landing into the water. So on behalf of the Friends of Pocosin Lakes and the local riverkeeper, an absolutely wonderful riverkeeper, again, tip to students here, if you have the chance to work with a riverkeeper, at a riverkeeper, in connection with a riverkeeper, to go to a riverkeeper conference, do it. So with Heather Deck and others, we intervened in this case. We were able to get a state court judge to say that even though it comes through the air and into the water, as a matter of law, that can be a Clean Water Act issue. Unfortunately, they didn't appeal that, so that's good law. But unfortunately, they went to federal court, and we're now fighting in federal court in kind of a collateral attack on that case, so we'll see what happens. The last issue I want to talk about, or the last case, is environmental injustice in North Carolina. This is the non-white population. You can see the relationship. Those dots are each hog facilities. There are 2,300 or so hog facilities. You see they're all in eastern North Carolina. There's basically nothing in the plateau or in the mountains. And you see the correlation with race, the non-white population here. This is also on the basis of income. This is a huge environmental justice issue. It's black land loss, it's air pollution, it's water pollution, it's an ability to enjoy your property, and the relationship with old slaveholding areas and sharecropping and now non-white populations in eastern North Carolina is really strong. I also just want to say this is a cumulative impact issue. That's hogs, that's poultry, and you can see while poultry is more spread out across the state, there is a relationship with poultry, the growth of poultry as well, and that's exacerbating the pollution in these areas. So we use Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination. It has very broad language. Under some case law in the Supreme Court, this case Alexander versus Sandoval, we can't go to court unless we show intentional discrimination, but the Environmental Protection Agency, like every agency, has regulations which say if you take our money, you can't discriminate, and that includes actions with an unjustified disproportionate impact on the basis of race. So we filed a complaint with the Environmental Protection Agency on behalf of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, Waterkeeper, and a local group called REACH. That, by the way, is the wonderful Steve Wing who I talked about earlier, who's the epidemiologist, that's Larry Baldwin, who works with Waterkeeper, that's a protest by the EJ network. So we filed a complaint saying that the state permitting these 2,300 hog facilities without looking at the racially disproportionate impact and having an unjustified disproportionate impact on the basis of race was discriminatory. And while there are water effects and property value effects, a lot of the actual effects that we're alleging are air impacts, right? Are your ability to enjoy your property, are the odor, are the health issues that come from ingesting all of this. And I won't talk a lot about the legal standards, but we did pass all the jurisdictional issues. They accepted this case for investigation, and we're now in it. And we have to show, and EPA has to find, in order to do anything with this case, that there are adverse effects, which are the subject of this, and we don't think that's a problem, and that those adverse effects are borne disproportionately. And again, that shouldn't be a problem because statistically, African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans are disproportionately impacted. This is a chart we put in with the complaint that shows that disproportionality. Those dots are industrial hog operations. The disproportionality is even greater if you look at where more hogs are located. That is, each one of those dots is a facility, but if you look at where the big facilities are and how many hogs people are exposed to, there's an even greater disproportionality. And the effects on communities that don't have adequate health facilities and are exposed to other problems are enormous. So I think I'll stop there. I hope if you get nothing else out of this, these few minutes, that I've convinced you that air impacts are enormous and that there's a lot we can do about it. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers. We have about 5 minutes for questions. So I'll probably take about 1 or 2 questions if anyone has any. I saw your hand first.
Yeah, the whole link to the civil rights issue is very new to me, and I was wondering, are there more resources on that? Are there groups that study that particular link or that association and the work that's being done there?
There are. I would start with Steve Wing. He has a TED Talk that I recommend just as an introduction. So you can go online to TED Talks and Steve Wing. And then if you go to the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network's website, North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, that will give you some starting points. Also, if you just Google CAFOs and environmental justice, there are some environmental health perspective studies, and if you Google Steve Wing and Google Sacoby Wilson, they're 2 epidemiologists, so you'll get S-A-C-O-B-I or Y. There are a whole bunch of epidemiological studies that relate proximity to facilities with adverse health outcomes, and also talk about the disproportionality. So those are some starting points, and I'd be happy to provide others.
Yeah, what about like workers' rights and that kind of, that end of the spectrum?
There are tremendous issues involving workers' rights. They're both worker health issues, which may or may not pay attention to the racial impact, and I should say it's both race and income. Like Newton County, where this Buffalo River case is a very low income area, and that's part of the problem, that the community is really dependent on tourism, and it could just devastate this community, even though it's a 99.9% white community. It's a low income community. In terms of the workers, there are health issues, and there is a lot, there's some litigation on workers' compensation and disability. There's a woman named Mona Lisa Wallace of the Wallace and Graham Law Firm in North Carolina that's done a lot of that. Southern Environmental Law Center has done some of it over time. And then there are also some real environmental justice worker issues. The Tar Heel plant that is controlled by Smithfield in North Carolina, if you Google that, the first thing that came up when I first started Googling it and looking at it was racial stratification at the Tar Heel plant in terms of who gets what jobs. And the stories, if you talk to the lawyers who do these disability cases, are just extraordinary. You know, there was that huge fire in the Delmarva, the poultry area in Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, where a whole bunch of poultry workers were killed when a fire broke out and they were locked in maybe 15 years ago. And in Tar Heel, you know, the workers are on this assembly line, and literally, I heard this one story about this guy's hand, you know, he did the same repetitive action with these frozen, you know, carcasses over and over and over, and his hand was so stiff that they taped the knife into his hand, and he was, you know, doing this over and over. It was just horrible, horrible situations. And I'll just say one more thing, and I'll stop. Which is, I think, one of the most awful things I've seen in all of this work, and as Edita was saying, and you know, we've heard, it's just, on every level, it's appalling. Humans, the environment, you know, animals, every level. But Rick Dove showed, I'm sure you've seen this too, he does a wonderful orientation for people who get involved in this work, and he showed this video. He did like a 2-hour orientation for my colleagues and me, and he showed this video that was an undercover video that may have been done by Humane Society, of workers in a facility that had to go through and kill baby hogs or hogs that were ill. And they did it with a hammer. And you literally see this hammer swinging. And I have to say that I felt for the hogs, you know, and that part was just horrifying, to be killed by a hammer. As much as killing in any way is terrible, but I also felt for the workers in that facility who were working for a facility that didn't have any kind of mechanism for handling, you know, whatever you're going to do with the animals, and how they slept at night, I'll never know. And so, you know, the worker issues are just very moving.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we have run out of time for questions, but I believe all the panelists will be available during lunch and the reception afterwards, so you can direct additional questions from them. So thank you all, and thank you again to our panelists.